The bus rumbled along the cracked asphalt of Highway 70, cutting through the flat, endless stretch of Missouri farmland. Dorian Carter leaned his forehead against the cool glass of the window, watching the world blur past, fields of corn giving way to suburban sprawl, where identical houses sat in neat rows like soldiers on parade. Each one had the same beige siding, the same manicured lawn, the same basketball hoop bolted above the garage. It was a world that felt both familiar and alien. A place where he was already an outsider before he'd even stepped off the bus. This wasn't his first time being the new kid. At 16, Dorian had already bounced between 3 schools in 3 different states, first Chicago, then Indianapolis, and now Lincoln Heights, Missouri, a town so small it barely registered on a map. His mom, Angela, had landed a better job at a hospital here, managing medical records with a salary that promised stability. A fresh start, she'd called it, her voice bright with hope as she packed their apartment in Indy. Dorian's uncle, Marcus, had echoed the sentiment over the phone, his deep voice steady and reassuring. See it as a chance to reset, D. Make it what you want. But Dorian knew better. Fresh starts didn't exist when you looked like him, tall, black, with a frame that suggested strength even when he slouched to avoid attention. In a town like Lincoln Heights, where the population was whiter than the picket fences lining the streets, he was already marked. The bus slowed as it entered the town, passing a faded welcome sign that read, Lincoln Heights, a community of pride. Dorian snorted softly. Pride for who exactly? He adjusted his earbuds, letting the low thrum of Kendrick Lamar's voice drown out the hum of the engine. The other passengers, a mix of tired commuters and a few kids his age, barely glanced his way, but he felt their eyes all the same. It was a skill he'd honed over the years, sensing the weight of stares without needing to meet them. His mom had taught him that too. Keep your head up, but don't give them a reason to notice you. Easier said than done. By the time the bus pulled into the station, the sky was bruising purple, the kind of twilight that made everything feel heavier. Dorian slung his backpack over one shoulder and stepped onto the pavement, his sneakers scuffing against the gravel. The air smelled of cut grass and diesel, a combination that felt oddly comforting. He glanced at his phone, 6:47 p.m. His mum wouldn't be home from her shift until after 9, so he had time to kill. He pulled up a map app and started walking toward their new apartment, a modest 2-bedroom on the edge of town. The streets were quiet, the kind of quiet that made every sound, a dog barking, a car engine revving, feel like an intrusion. He kept his pace steady, his shoulders relaxed, but his eyes scanned the shadows. You didn't grow up in the neighborhoods he had without learning to stay alert. The next morning, Ridgemont High loomed ahead like a fortress. Its red brick facade was chipped in places, the windows smudged with years of neglect, but the sprawling campus screamed money. New athletic fields, a gleaming gym, and a parking lot filled with cars that looked too nice for high school kids. Dorian adjusted his hoodie, the black fabric worn but clean, and stepped through the front gates. The air shifted immediately. Conversations paused as he passed, heads turning just long enough to size him up before looking away. He felt it in his bones, the pause, the glance, the quick dismissal. It wasn't new, but it stung all the same. The hallways were a maze of lockers and posters advertising homecoming and pep rallies, the kind of school spirit that felt like a foreign language to him. His schedule, printed on a crumpled sheet of paper, led him to first period English. The teacher, Ms. Hargrove, was a middle-aged woman with a tight bun and a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You must be Dorian," she said, her voice overly warm, like she was trying to compensate for something. "Welcome to Ridgemont. Take a seat anywhere." He nodded, choosing a desk near the back, where he could keep his eyes on the room without drawing attention. The other students filed in, their chatter fading as they noticed him. A few stole glances, their expressions unreadable. Others didn't bother hiding their curiosity, their eyes lingering on his braids, his hoodie, the way he sat with his shoulders squared. The morning passed in a blur of introductions and syllabi. Dorian kept his head down, answering when called on but offering nothing more. He wasn't here to make waves. By lunch, though, the weight of being watched had settled into his skin like an itch he couldn't scratch. The cafeteria was a sea of noise. Trays clattering, voices overlapping, laughter cutting through the hum. He grabbed a tray of soggy pizza and a carton of milk, scanning the room for a place to sit. Most tables were claimed, cliques already formed, their boundaries invisible but ironclad. He spotted an empty seat near a guy who was engrossed in his phone, earbuds dangling from one ear. It wasn't ideal, but it would do. Dorian had barely set his tray down when a voice sliced through the din. "You lost?" He turned, meeting the eyes of a blond guy with a smirk that screamed trouble. The guy leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed, his table surrounded by a crew of friends who watched with lazy amusement. Dorian exhaled slowly, his face a mask of calm. "Didn't know I needed a map," he said, his voice low but steady. The guy chuckled, shaking his head. "Just making sure, not a lot of new faces around here." The unspoken part of that sentence hung in the air, heavy and sharp. Dorian caught it, the way the guy's eyes flicked over him, sizing him up, deciding what he was before he'd even spoken. He met the guy's stare, his expression unreadable. "Guess I'm the exception." The smirk widened, but there was something else behind it. Amusement, interest, maybe a challenge. "Welcome to Ridgemont, man." The words were friendly, but the tone wasn't. Dorian didn't respond. He just sat down, picked up his fork and started eating. The message was clear. This was only the beginning. The blonde guy's name was Bryce Tanner, and it didn't take long for Dorian to learn who he was. By the end of the day, he'd heard the whispers in the hallways, seen the way people deferred to Bryce like he was untouchable. Quarterback, student council president, son of a man who owned half the car dealerships in town. Bryce walked through Ridgemont like he owned it, his crew trailing behind him like loyal dogs. And for reasons Dorian couldn't yet fathom, Bryce had decided that Dorian's presence was a problem. The taunts started small, almost subtle. A muttered comment as Dorian passed in the hallway. "Didn't know they let guys like him in here." A snicker from one of Bryce's friends, loud enough to make sure Dorian heard. "Wonder how long he'll last." Dorian ignored it, his jaw tight, his eyes forward. He'd heard worse in Chicago, where the stakes were higher and the consequences sharper. This was nothing, he told himself. Just noise. But Bryce wasn't the type to let things go. The first real test came on Wednesday, as Dorian stood at his locker, swapping out his history textbook for his math notebook. He sensed the movement before he felt it. A sharp bump against his shoulder, hard enough to knock him into the metal. The clang echoed down the hall, drawing eyes. "Oops," Bryce said, his voice dripping with fake innocence. "Didn't see you there." Dorian didn't react. He finished grabbing his notebook, shut his locker, and turned to face Bryce. The quarterback stood a few inches shorter than Dorian but carried himself like he was 10 feet tall. His friends, Nick, Kyle, maybe a third whose name Dorian didn't care to learn, flanked him, their grins sharp and expectant. Dorian kept his movements slow, deliberate, his face blank. "You're quiet, huh?" Bryce said, his smirk flickering. "That's cool, real cool." Dorian held his gaze, not angry, not scared, just looking. For a moment, Bryce's confidence wavered, his eyes narrowing. Then Nick, or maybe Kyle, muttered something under his breath, and Bryce's grin returned, wider than before. "Catch you later, new guy." They sauntered off, their laughter blending with the hallway noise. The second incident was less subtle. It was Friday, and Dorian was crossing the cafeteria with his tray, heading toward the trash cans. He didn't see the foot until it was too late, a deliberate extension of Bryce's leg, timed perfectly to trip him. Dorian's body jolted forward, his tray tipping, but he caught himself before he hit the ground. Laughter erupted, sharp and mocking. Bryce held up his hands, his face a mask of innocence. "Relax, man. It was a joke." Dorian didn't respond. He stepped over Bryce's foot, dumped his tray, and kept walking. The laughter followed him, someone muttering, "Too easy." He clenched his jaw, his uncle's voice echoing in his head. "A lion doesn't flinch when the hyenas bark." He exhaled, letting the tension drain from his shoulders. But he knew it wasn't over. Bryce wasn't playing for laughs anymore. He was testing him, pushing to see how far he could go. The third time, Bryce made sure it wasn't just a game. It was after school, the parking lot half empty, the air heavy with the promise of rain. Dorian had stayed late in the library, working on a history essay. He liked the quiet of the empty school, the way it felt like a pause from the noise of the day. As he stepped outside, he heard voices, too familiar, too close. "Hey, new guy." He barely had time to turn before something hit his back, hard and wet. He staggered forward, catching himself on the pavement. Laughter rang out, sharp and cruel. Dorian straightened slowly, glancing down at his hoodie, now splattered with soda, ice cubes scattered at his feet. Bryce stood a few feet away, still holding the empty drink cup, the last drops dripping from his fingers. "Damn, my bad," he said, not even pretending to mean it. "Didn't see you there." Dorian inhaled through his nose, his breath steady despite the heat rising in his chest. Bryce's crew, Nick, Kyle, and a couple of others, stood behind him, their grins wide and expectant. A few other students lingered in the lot, their phones already out, ready to capture whatever came next. Silence stretched heavy and taut. Bryce smirked, stepping closer. "Come on, man, say something." Dorian didn't. He started to walk past, his movements calm, controlled. That's when Bryce shoved him, hard, deliberate, meant to provoke. Dorian stumbled back a step, his breath catching. Bryce laughed, his voice sharp. "What, you scared?" Nick stepped forward, his grin vicious. "Nah, man, he's just soft." Dorian's fingers flexed at his sides. He could hear his uncle's voice again. "Keep your hands in your pockets. Don't give them what they want." But Bryce wasn't looking for an easy laugh anymore. He wanted a reaction, a fight, a chance to prove something. Dorian took one last deep breath, then set his backpack down, slow and deliberate. Bryce raised an eyebrow, his smirk widening. "Oh, you got something to say now?" Dorian didn't answer. He rolled his shoulders back, his stance shifting, his body loose but ready. Bryce opened his mouth to say something else, but he never got the chance. Dorian moved, one step in, quick and clean. A left feint, just enough to make Bryce flinch, then a sharp right hook to his ribs. The sound was sickening, a dull thud followed by Bryce's choked gasp as his body folded. Dorian pivoted, his form perfect, and delivered an uppercut that snapped Bryce's head back. The quarterback's legs buckled, and he hit the pavement hard, his drink cup skittering across the asphalt. Silence fell, heavy and absolute. Nick and the others stared, their mouths open, their bravado gone. Dorian stepped back, adjusting his hoodie, his breath steady. Bryce groaned, rolling onto his side, his hand clutching his ribs. Dorian's voice was calm, almost soft. "You done?" Bryce didn't answer, just coughed, his face pale. Dorian looked at the others, his gaze steady. "Anyone else?" No one moved. He grabbed his backpack, slung it over his shoulder, and walked away without another word. The crowd parted, their whispers trailing him like smoke. He didn't look back. By Monday morning, the entire school knew Dorian's name. He didn't need to check his phone to figure that out. The way people looked at him said it all. The stares weren't just curiosity anymore, they were something else. Some were impressed, their eyes wide with a mix of awe and caution. Others were nervous, their glances quick and skittish, like they were afraid he'd noticed them. A few looked at him like they were seeing him for the first time, their preconceptions shattered by what had happened in the parking lot. Bryce wasn't in school, which didn't surprise Dorian. Taking a hit like that in front of half the student body wasn't something you bounced back from overnight. Nick and Kyle kept their distance, their usual swagger replaced by a wary silence. Dorian walked into first period like nothing had happened, his hoodie clean now, his notebook tucked under his arm. He sat at his usual desk, pulled out a pen, and started copying the day's agenda from the board. Business as usual. But the school wasn't done talking. At lunch, the cafeteria buzzed with whispers, conversations quieting as he passed. A few students nodded at him, their gestures small but deliberate, like they were acknowledging a new kind of respect. Some freshmen, Kids who hadn't even spoken to him before stared at him like he was a legend, their eyes bright with excitement. "Damn, didn't know new guy had hands," someone muttered as he walked by, their voice low but clear. Another added, "Bryce had it coming. Heard he's not coming back for a week." Dorian ignored it, his tray balanced in one hand as he found a seat. He wasn't here to be a hero and he didn't want their validation, but as he sat down, he heard something else, soft but cutting. "He's just another violent thug." The words came from a nearby table where a brunette girl with expensive-looking jewelry sat with her friends. Her expression was sour, like she'd smelled something bad. She looked away when she realized Dorian had heard her, her cheeks flushing slightly. His stomach clenched, a familiar ache settling in. That was the thing about moments like these. No matter how justified you were, no matter how right it felt to stand your ground, someone always found a way to twist it. To them, he wasn't just a kid who'd defended himself. He was a stereotype, a story they'd already written in their heads. He turned back to his tray, his jaw tight, and forced himself to eat. The pizza tasted like cardboard, but he chewed slowly, methodically, refusing to let the words sink deeper than they already had. He didn't regret what he'd done. Bryce had been looking for a fight and Dorian had given him one, but the weight of it lingered, heavy and unshakable. He'd spent years training, boxing with his uncle in a cramped gym in Chicago, learning to control his strength, his anger, his fear, years walking away from fights, ignoring the taunts, keeping his hands in his pockets. That wasn't weakness, it was discipline, strength. So why did it feel like no matter what he did, people had already decided who he was? The rest of the week passed in a strange haze. Bryce still hadn't returned and his absence left a vacuum that Dorian felt in every glance, every whispered conversation. Nick and Kyle avoided him, their eyes darting away when he passed them in the halls. The stares from other students softened, the whispers growing quieter, but the air still felt charged, like the school was waiting for something to happen. On Thursday, as Dorian left the gym after PE, Coach Harrison called him over. "Got a minute, Carter?" The coach was a broad-shouldered man in his 40s, with a voice that carried the weight of someone who'd seen a lot, but didn't let it show. Dorian hesitated, his guard up. He wasn't in the mood for a lecture, but something in the coach's tone made him stop. They walked outside, standing near the track where the football team was running drills, their shouts echoing across the field. "I heard what happened," Coach Harrison said, his arms crossed. "Figured you had your reasons." Dorian nodded, his jaw tight. He wasn't about to apologize, and he didn't think the coach expected him to. Harrison studied him for a moment, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You a fighter?" Dorian shrugged. "Been boxing since I was a kid." The coach let out a low whistle. "Yeah, that much was obvious. You're good, but let me ask you something. Did that fight change anything?" Dorian frowned, unsure where this was going. He shifted his weight, his sneakers scuffing against the gravel. "What do you mean?" "You think Bryce learned something?" Harrison asked, his voice steady. "Think the rest of them did?" Dorian exhaled, running a hand over his braids. He knew the answer. Bryce wasn't the type to reflect. He'd come back with a bruised ego and a bigger mouth. As for the others, some respected Dorian now, some feared him, and some would always see him as the girl in the cafeteria had, a thug, a threat, a problem. He didn't say any of that, but the coach seemed to read it in his silence. "People like Bryce," Harrison said, his voice low, "they don't really lose, not in a way that sticks. He'll come back, run his mouth, and the cycle starts again. But you're different. You've got control." Dorian's frown deepened. "What are you saying?" The coach tilted his head toward the field, where the football players were finishing their drills. "I've been telling the wrestling coach to send me a few kids for the team. You ever thought about putting all that skill to better use?" Dorian blinked, caught off guard. "Wrestling?" Harrison grinned, a rare flash of warmth in his expression. "Look, I know you can handle yourself, that much is obvious, but there's a difference between winning a fight and learning how to own your power. I've seen too many kids like you get boxed into a reputation they never wanted. You already proved you're not to be messed with. Now prove there's more to you than that. Dorian didn't answer right away. For so long, fighting had been about survival, standing his ground in neighborhoods where looking weak wasn't an option, where a wrong glance could escalate into something deadly. Boxing had given him discipline, a way to channel the anger that simmered beneath his skin. But the way Coach Harrison was looking at him, the way he spoke, it wasn't about proving a point. It was about being more. That night, Dorian sat on the edge of his bed staring at his uncle's old boxing gloves. They were worn, the leather cracked at the seams, but they carried memories of late nights in the gym, of Marcus's voice barking instructions, of the pride in his eyes when Dorian landed a clean jab. He thought about all the times he'd held back, all the times he'd walked away, and the one time he hadn't. Coach was right. Bryce wouldn't change. The school would think what they wanted, but Dorian still had a choice. The next week brought a shift, subtle but undeniable. Bryce returned on Tuesday, his face still bruised, his swagger dimmed but not gone. He didn't approach Dorian, didn't even look at him, but his presence changed the air. The whispers started again, sharper now, laced with speculation. "Heard Bryce's dad is pissed," someone said in the hallway. "Might try to get Dorian suspended." Another voice countered, "Good luck with that. Half the school saw what happened. Bryce started it." Dorian kept his head down, his routine unchanged. He went to class, did his work, ate his lunch alone. But the weight of the fight followed him, a shadow he couldn't shake. The freshmen still stared at him like he was a hero, but the older students were more cautious, their glances tinged with something he couldn't quite name, respect, fear, or maybe both. The girl from the cafeteria, the one who'd called him a thug, avoided his eyes now, but her words lingered in his mind, a reminder of how easily people reduced him to a label. On Wednesday, Coach Harrison found him again, this time in the hallway after last period. "Thought about what I said?" he asked, leaning against a locker. Dorian shrugged, his backpack heavy on his shoulder. "A little." "Come by practice tomorrow," Harrison said. "Just watch, no pressure." Dorian nodded, more to end the conversation than anything else. But the idea stuck with him, nagging at the edges of his thoughts. Wrestling wasn't boxing, it was controlled, structured, a sport with rules and boundaries. It wasn't about survival or proving a point. It was about skill, discipline, maybe even belonging. He wasn't sure he was ready for that, but he was tired of carrying the weight of his reputation alone. Thursday afternoon, he found himself in the gym, standing at the edge of the wrestling room. The air smelled of sweat and rubber mats, the sound of grunts and thuds filling the space. A dozen kids were paired off, grappling under the watchful eye of Coach Ramirez, a wiry man with a sharp voice and a clipboard. Harrison stood nearby, his arms crossed, his eyes scanning the room. When he saw Dorian, he nodded, gesturing for him to come closer. Dorian watched as two wrestlers circled each other, their movements deliberate, almost like a dance. One lunged, grabbing the other's leg, and they went down in a tangle of limbs, each fighting for control. It was different from boxing. No punches, no knockouts, just technique and leverage. But there was something familiar in it too, the focus, the control, the way every move mattered. "What do you think?" Harrison asked, his voice low. Dorian shrugged, but his eyes stayed on the mat. "Looks intense." "It is," Harrison said, "but it's also a place where you can be more than what people think you are." Dorian didn't respond, but he stayed until practice ended, watching the wrestlers pack up, their faces flushed with effort. Coach Ramirez approached him, his clipboard tucked under his arm. "You're Carter, right? Harrison says you've got skills." Dorian nodded, unsure what to say. Ramirez studied him for a moment, then grinned. "Come back tomorrow. We'll put you through some drills. See what you've got." That night, Dorian lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. His mom was still at work, the apartment quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator. He thought about the fight, about Bryce's crumpled form on the pavement, about the whispers in the cafeteria. He thought about his uncle, who taught him that strength wasn't just about hitting hard, but about knowing when to hold back. And he thought about Coach Harrison's words, "Prove there's more to you than that." The next day, he showed up to wrestling practice. Ramirez didn't waste time. pairing him with a senior named Javier, a lean kid with quick feet and a quiet confidence. "Go easy," Ramirez said, but Javier just grinned, sizing Dorian up. The first drill was simple. Stance and movement, learning how to shift your weight, how to anticipate your opponent. Dorian felt awkward at first, his body used to the rhythm of boxing, but Javier was patient, correcting his form with a nod or a quick word. By the end of the session, Dorian was sweating, his muscles burning in ways they hadn't in years. But there was something else too, a spark he hadn't felt since his first days in the boxing gym. It wasn't just about proving himself, it was about learning, growing, becoming something more. Ramirez clapped him on the shoulder as he left. "Not bad, Carter. Keep showing up." Over the next few weeks, Dorian settled into a rhythm. School, wrestling practice, homework, repeat. Bryce and his crew kept their distance, their taunts replaced by a grudging silence. The whispers in the cafeteria faded, replaced by new gossip, new dramas. But Dorian felt the change in himself. Wrestling wasn't just a sport, it was a way to channel the anger, the frustration, the weight of being seen as something he wasn't. On the mat, he wasn't the new kid or the guy who'd knocked out Bryce Tanner. He was just Dorian, learning to move, to think, to fight in a new way. One afternoon, as he walked home from practice, his phone buzzed. It was a text from his mom. "Proud of you, D. Keep doing you." He smiled, the first real smile he'd felt in weeks. Maybe this wasn't a fresh start, not the way his mom or uncle had meant it, but it was something better, a chance to define himself, not by what others thought, but by what he chose to fight for. If you liked this story, please like, subscribe, and share it with others so they can learn something from it too.